You're listening to the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. If you consider many of the stories that exist in our world that have heroes or fantasy themes, you can often identify creatures that are woven throughout those stories, and most of those stories have a specific type of creature that sort of becomes synonymous with the adventure itself. In Lord of the Rings, you have the orcs, which are a common occurring theme, but then you have entire genres of stories that focus on certain types of creatures, like vampire films or werewolf stories, or even Starship Troopers has giant bugs as their main creature type that the heroes have to face off against. But the through line of all these stories is that sometimes a better story is told when there is a central theme to the creatures that the heroes are facing off against. I'm Robert Walker, the author of Session Zero, the DMG to writing great campaigns in any system. And this is my show where I teach collaborative storytellers how to run better campaigns through psychology. And today we're going to be talking about creature-centered campaigns. And in order to have this conversation, I'm joined by two members of the 20 Sides podcast. So let's meet our guests.
Hey, I'm Matt. I am the Dungeon Master of the 20 Sides podcast.
And I'm Bobby. I play Yaros, the overconfident dwarf on the 20 Sides podcast.
Welcome to the show, you two. Very excited to have you on. So your podcast, 20 Sides, really early on broke into the top 100, which is amazing. And it's pretty easy to see why, listening to the show. I mean, you guys have a lot of fun. Everybody plays off of each other really well. You do fun voices, and the story is very compelling. Can you tell my listeners a little bit about your podcast and your story, what got you there?
Yeah, so we are a live play D&D podcast. We are fast-paced. It's story-driven. We play by the rules, but rule of cool, it trumps all in our game. And so you'll hear a lot of cool things that maybe not happen in a normal Dungeons and Dragons game. And like you were saying, I think one thing that truly sets our podcast apart is there's a huge distinct difference between each of the characters. So Yaros and Bobby will obviously talk about him, and then Leo and Seven and Ordella. Like, you can truly hear the difference between each of the podcasts. And way early on, before we even launched, we did a lot of what we called market research. It's not really market research at all. It was a lot of Twitter polls and Reddit polls to kind of get a feel for what the community was wanting out of live play D&D podcasts. And based on all that research, we went and we recorded several times our first episode, and we got a ton of feedback on those as we tweaked those. And continued to record our first episode multiple times until we got something that we were happy with, that our listeners were happy with, and then we launched in September. And so, Bobby, if you want to add anything to any of that.
Yeah, man, I'd just piggyback and just talk about the characters. How Matt says, we're all pretty distinct. Yeah, me and Philip and Jess, I think, took a lot of time building up those characters, knowing that it had to be a little different as a podcast. You can't just play, you're going to have to stay in character a lot more on a podcast than you might at just your typical table, sitting around playing with your friends. So we really had to think about, what character could we stay in and really stay true to. So I think we all kind of found a good spot there.
Yeah, I definitely think that's something that's true. I know my gaming group has talked on and off about maybe doing a one-shot or even jumping into that actual play thing, but we do spend a lot of time around the table when we're together just chit-chatting, shooting the shit, having a good time and laughing. And I would say, in a 6-hour session, 2 hours of actual D&D is being played, and the other 4 hours is just, bullshitting with each other and having a good time. How different is the feel of doing an actual play where you're sort of staying in character and not getting as distracted?
That's typically about how our typical play would look like as well, that kind of breakdown. I think I've actually enjoyed trying to stay in character more. I like the challenge of making and talking about my decision making process in character, and why my character would make those decisions. So it's been a challenge. It's been different. I wouldn't say it's better or worse than just sitting around playing with your friends, not having to worry about the podcast itself, but just a little different.
Yeah, and from a DM perspective, it's a lot different because when you're just playing at the table, if you use a voice that's the same that you've used 10 times before, that's good, that's fine. But
right.
If you're recording for a podcast, you don't want every single voice to sound the same. You don't want every single NPC to have kind of the same personality, and then you want your world to really, really feel alive. Where again, if you're just playing at the table and you're not recording, it's not the end of the world if there are some timelines that don't match up. If there's not, that kind of thing. Where if we're recording for a podcast and we talk all the time and like, okay, what's the timeline of this? Like, was this 30 years ago? But if it was 30 years ago, that couldn't have happened. So I'll have to change this and adjust this. And then just a level of detail about each town and kind of how to make those unique so that the listener isn't like, wait a minute, this feels like the exact same town, just with a different name on it.
Right.
And so making sure that from a DM perspective, that everything is fresh and new, because you're not creating, you're creating it for listeners more so than you're just playing at the table for fun. It's still so much fun. Like Bobby said, it's a cool challenge to kind of stretch me as a DM and to stretch them as players.
I think everybody probably goes to the table a little bit more aware and conscious of each person having their time to speak and not really piling on conversation around the table.
Definitely, yeah.
Bobby, you're dwarf. How did you settle on the voice? Like it's really, it's fun, it's unique, and every time you do it, I'm just like, man, that's a really great voice. I need to throw that as an NPC in one of my games. It's really good.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I know, the dwarf commonly uses the Scottish accent.
Right.
And Philip, who plays Seven, actually has a really good Scottish accent. We kind of played around when he was when we were doing our first episode. The first time we played through, he kind of tried the Scottish accent, and I've played around with that accent as well. It's a difficult one for me to stay in long term, and there's certain words and things that are just harder to bring into the conversation. But the Russian, or what I call Russian, everybody kind of says it's more of kind of like a Middle Eastern European, which is fine. It's one I feel I can stay in easier, and I don't know, it's just a fun accent.
I think that's kind of what's interesting about it, because it does have sort of those Russian undertones, but it also has like a spattering of other things that really kind of makes it unique, which I think is what makes it so interesting to listen to. Anyways, moving on to another question. Could you share with me and the listeners a favorite moment you've had in recording the show, or a favorite character moment that you've had?
Yeah, I'll go. One of my favorites so far is the introduction of Ordella. So I was really, me, Matt, and Philip have known each other for since high school, and me and Matt have known each other since kindergarten. So we have a really good chemistry between us. And then Matt's wife Jess obviously has a great chemistry as well. So bringing in that fourth character was scary. And we didn't really do any kind of like test runs before. It's like that first recording of Ordella is our first time playing with her, and I think she just joined in perfectly. Had some one-liners in there that just made us all crack up. So I was like, okay, she's great. So that's probably one of my favorite moments.
Nice.
Yeah, for me, I'll have two. Episode 16, one of our, I guess, the early on villain, Panner Glenwood, has a little switcheroo, has a little change, and a lot of his backstory is revealed. And being able to do that in character at the table and to see the players' reactions was really neat. And then a second one, Ordella's backstory. We recorded a few episodes of that before Ordella came onto the scene for the actual campaign. And there's a scene toward the end where Philip, who's playing Baron at that time, gets really choked up, like in real life, and he had to stop talking or he was going to start crying. And it was so cool to see. It was my first D&D moment ever where somebody got so choked up that they were about to cry. And that was a really neat moment for all of us at the table. And everybody at the table was like, okay, we gotta stop for a second, because I'm not going to cry playing make believe. Like, it's not going to happen.
It's interesting you bring that up. I mean, I've talked about it on my show a few times. I do remember very vividly there was a scene we had in one of our long-running campaigns where, I'm describing the scene and what's happening to this character who sacrificed their life. And when I look up, I've got, three middle-aged men and they're all crying at the table. And it was just like, wow, the power of storytelling really is something incredible. When you invest yourself in a character and you really get into that willful suspension of disbelief, it's amazing what you can experience through that.
Yeah, it is cool. And I'm a dad. All of us are dads at the table. All the guys are. And I don't know what it was. Like once I became a dad, I became a lot softer than I was previously, and I was always kind of a softie. My son and I were watching Mighty Ducks 2 the other night, and I had to walk out of the room because I was about to start crying at Mighty Ducks 2. And so
funny.
you can imagine like seeing this character about to die or potentially about to sacrifice his life to save Ordella. Like just, you're thinking about your own kids and all that stuff, and it all just comes together.
Yeah, that is very true. I agree with that. After I became a father, any show that had like emotional father-daughter scenes they wreck me instantly. I don't know where it just happens. Let's move on to our main topic today. So, Cyclothids, what we're going to be talking about today is building a campaign around a very specific creature or one creature or a group of creatures. One of the most notable ones that you can think of in D&D that I've always thought of as a great campaign-centered creature is the Tarrasque. It's been around for a long time. It's sort of one of those like fabled mythic creatures that only one of them exists, kind of like the Kraken. But I know there's already been a lot of stories and campaigns that have been run around that creature. So I want to branch out a little bit. I want to talk about some other creatures maybe and the reasons why you would want to center a campaign around one creature being your big bad evil guy or your main plot giver. What do the two of you think? Are there any stories in your past? It sounds like you've been gaming together for probably a pretty long time. Are there any creatures that stand out to you as just really great campaign-centered creatures?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the other than the Tarrasque, even probably more obvious than that. I always think a good dragon.
Yeah.
Is the best to center around. A couple of things I like about that is the age levels of dragons can lend themselves to different levels of campaigns. Right? You can have like a young adult dragon if you have a lower level campaign, or you can get the the ancient red dragon in there if you plan on taking a campaign all the way to the higher levels, and then different colors of the chromatic dragons, so you can place them somewhere. It doesn't all have to be in a cave where you run into a red dragon. It could be in the swamps with a black dragon or something like that. And I like using the dragon in human form at some point in the story, and then you can kind of hide them as a different character. Again, it's called Dungeons and Dragons probably for a reason, just because the dragon's so iconic.
I definitely agree with that point you make about using them as in like their shapeshifted form. That is sort of it's very classic, but it's also a lot of fun. I think it's really cool to have that sort of mundane interaction with your characters that then later on they can find out was a big piece of something that they hadn't even recognized at the time. And I think that's just a fun callback when they remember it and they're like, oh, holy cow, that was the dragon the whole time.
Yeah, I think for me, I like to focus on your almost like your humanoid monsters, goblins, orcs, gnolls, even kobolds. And with kobolds, obviously the dragon would be the big bad evil guy. But thinking about like anything that are just these savage creatures. So like orcs, gnolls for me are two big go-tos if I wanted to build a campaign around one monster type, because when you do that, now you can have orcs that are cleric orcs, you can have wizard orcs, you can have sorcerer orcs. There's all the different types of orcs in the monster manual or in Volo's guide or Monsters to the Multiverse. And so you can do that, and then building your encounters around that, you can have them overtaking a town and the party comes to that, and then they've got to either stop them or help stop or whatever that looks like. They can go infiltrate the orc camp. They can you can build a bunch of different encounters when you're looking at like a humanoid type of race. That makes it a little bit easier, I think, for me to build multiple different layers along the way.
I think a smart thing about using humanoid creatures like that sort of have the ability to scale over the course of the campaign.
Yeah.
It does eliminate one of the big challenges of doing a creature-centric campaign, which is sometimes you have to just show them this big bad evil guy that they're going to eventually face, and then they're like off screen, or the party thinks, oh, well, there's no chance we can defeat them right now. Right. Yeah. It's but with scaling creatures, you can keep going deeper and deeper into levels of those monsters as they are getting more powerful, and you're getting closer and closer to the final end boss who's controlling them all, which I think that's a good way of keeping it centered on a specific creature, but also giving you more flexibility.
Yeah. Like first level, you're looking at like a couple of wandering orcs that maybe got separated from the tribe or the group, and then you got a war band, and now you're starting to wonder, why are all these orcs coming down from the mountain, or why are they coming out of their cave, or whatever that may be. And then maybe you got to go infiltrate and figure out why, and then you figure out why, and now they're destroying a town, and you just kind of build it up as you go.
That's a lot of fun. In your guys' campaigns, have you had any that have been centered around a single creature or a group of creatures that have been pretty successful?
You could kind of say the one we're going through now has a pretty big undead flair to it, but I don't think I've necessarily been a part of a campaign that just strictly has one specific monster type as like the go-to for it.
I mean, undead's another great one. Like,
yeah,
because that's another one you have a lot of variation, and you can always have one big bad evil necromancer at the very end that's sort of controlling and directing all of this, and they can face every sort of, undead that's out there while still having that same central theme. I know one thing I really like to do is, especially for my big bad evil monsters, I like to combine them, give them something unique that's really not necessarily in the books. Templates are a lot of fun, but if you're going like with the dragon motif, the Dracolich is, I think, a little more interesting for a big bad evil guy. Or you get to the end and you throw them together with an Illithid and you have a Dracolithid or something like that. That's just like, take the craziness of two really powerful creatures and merge them into some abomination that's just going to blow their minds.
I think that's a really good idea too, because like so many D&D players love to look through the monster manual. They love to know what's happening with the monsters. And if you're mixing it up, changing things up, they can't say, oh, I know this creature is susceptible to fire, where, they have resistances here and there. But to be able to mix it up and change things up for a monster makes it a little challenging for the players for sure.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I've run into that a lot. Like, I've got some players who've been playing with me for 25 years, and, when it comes to typical creatures out of the monster manual, they know them pretty much as though they had written them 25 years.
Yeah,
They know every resistance, what kind of vulnerabilities they have. I think that's a good point. Just shaking it up so that they don't know what to expect is a good idea.
Yeah, and I think one drawback to having, the same monster type a lot occur in a campaign is combat can get stale. If you're fighting a ton of skeletons, or if you're fighting a ton of zombies, or whatever it is, orcs, combat can get stale. But the more that I've thought about combat, the more I've thought about monsters, is every monster is just a stat block. That's literally all they are. Their flavor is what they look like and how they act. And so making sure that each encounter you are planning is planned to the point where you're not just taking the monster into account. It's what is the monster doing other than just trying to fight you? What is the environment look like around the monster? Is there a rope bridge we're trying to cross? That's like the obvious one that everybody always brings up as an example. Like, we're trying to cross a rope bridge, there's an ogre on the other side. How are we getting across? And two goblins are trying to untie the rope bridge. Well, you can change the monsters, and the encounter is the exact same. In all actuality, like an orc and an ogre, if you take off the names, they're just a stat block. And so making sure that those monsters feel unique in the combat as a dungeon master, I think is really imperative if you're going to have the same type of monster in your campaign. Changing the environment, changing what they're trying to do so that the party is either trying to stop them or whatever's causing combat. Because if you just have a open grassland, or if you just have a cave with nothing in it, combat just turns into a slog a lot of times. And especially if you're feeling like, okay, I'm fighting these orcs again. Next level. Okay, now I'm fighting 5 orcs instead of 2. It just becomes a slog.
So let me ask Bobby, from the campaign that you're playing Yarost in right now, is there a specific creature that you've fought in that story that you would just either love or really hate to see as like the main story bad guy?
Yeah, I mean, I think Matt's building up, again, it's pretty undead centered. So like you said, a lich at the end is most likely going to be the case, or a Draco Lich or something like that.
Nice.
Which, that's one of my favorites. I know I've tried to build campaigns around a Lich as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just it's a fun creature. And Yarost as a barbarian, I like to play him as, some barbarians were played where they don't like magic and they don't like creatures that use magic. So it'll be fun to face off against the big bad end guy to be a magic user. Gives them a little more purpose.
It's true. When you marry a big powerful magic user like a lich with a super strong indestructible creature like a dragon, then you get that best of both worlds where all the party members really have a role to play, and I think that's really fun too. Your mages have a lot to do spellcasting wise, and you need somebody who can absorb the hits that the thing's laying down. And so I think that's a good way of bringing everybody in the party into the fight.
Yeah, and to pick up on what you said earlier about like combining 2 monsters without giving too much away for the podcast spoilers coming up, like 5 or 6 episodes down the line, that is one thing that has happened for this lich that will kind of make itself known throughout. There's a combo of lich and something else.
Nice.
So yeah, that
is awesome. One of the fun ones I did recently was an Illitholich, which was a lich illithid, and that was a lot of fun because you have the whole psionics thing, and we had the spellcasting, so we kind of got to merge with that, the 2 different spellcasting types. He was a little bit weak, a little bit squishy, but when it came to controlling the mind and throwing spells around, he was pretty awesome.
Just one other thing is to, as a DM, to make sure your characters are equipped. If you have a cleric who's, good against undead, having a campaign with undead in it, I think is a good idea to know what your characters are and know what their strengths are, and let them have some strengths in a lot of the battles that you'll be facing. So
yeah, I think that's a very good point. I've had DMs ask me in the past about what to do when they had built this idea, and then all of a sudden one of the characters is so strong against that idea, like how do they stop the character from always overcoming that? And I don't know that that's always a good way to look at it, because I think sometimes you want a challenge that is going to be specifically easy for one character, just so that they have that time to shine. They have that moment in the spotlight where they get to be, the main hero just for a few moments.
I agree.
Yeah, me and a few other DMs were talking the other day about balancing encounters, and like, how do you balance encounters to make sure that, one character doesn't just come in and wreck everything, or it's not too hard, or whatever that may be. And my answer to that has always been like, you don't have to balance encounters. Mm-hmm. The characters will know when it's time to flee if you make it known, like, hey, this may be too much for you guys. And then it's okay for characters to wreck things. It lets them feel powerful. It lets them feel like, okay, all this work I've put into my character is paying off. And so like having encounter, if every single combat is perfectly balanced to where I'm going to get through 2 or 3 in a day, then at some point they just all kind of start feeling the same.
Yeah, that's very true. I think that's a good point. And the variety of combat, I think, makes it feel more believable. Awesome. So let's go ahead and move on to our tricks of the trade. So for today's tricks of the trade, I've asked Matt and Bobby to come up with one idea each on a specific creature that they would build a campaign around. I also came with one of my own. I think I'll go ahead and go first. That way the 2 of you can have a little bit of time to collect your thoughts. And I like the idea of taking a very unique creature, merging 2 of them together, but then giving them something that makes them really intrinsic to the story. So, for example, with the Illitholich combination, it actually didn't end up coming out in story, but the way it was written was this Illitholich was a fallen deity that had lost his followers and lost all of his powers and was trying to essentially use his mind control abilities to regain enough followers through mental coercion that they could then ascend back to godhood. So something like that can really play throughout the story and the campaign. And I think if I were to reuse that character, I'd want to spend a little bit more time and really tie them to the world, really give them an integral part in not just being the bad guy, but being connected to the entire plot in a very important way.
Yeah, so one of the campaigns I haven't actually played through it, but I read through most of it is the Storm King's Thunder. So I like a campaign that where you face off against the giants, and you get to face off against like the head of each of the domains of the giants. So you get to face Storm Giant at one point, Cloud Giant. And you don't have to make them all combat encounters because with the flame giants or fire giants, their big thing is they like to be they show their strength by forging, right? So you could have maybe like a competition where with one of yours, like 7 is a cleric of the forge. So if you have that in your party, you can kind of lend yourself to that and say you have to craft something better than their best crafter to show your strength. Just again getting to have a couple of big encounters with each of the heads of the giant families.
Yeah, I like that idea a lot. It lets it stretch out through the course of a campaign a lot longer. And again, it's one of those things that you can start with the weaker giants and work their way up to the stronger giants. And I love your idea of including some encounters that are not intended to be battles. They're intended to be other clever ways of overcoming the encounter. That's very cool.
I'll say for me, because it's so close to home right now, I'll say undead, specifically a lich. I think one of the best part about undead is you can take any monster in the monster manual and turn it into an undead by just reflavoring it, just reskinning it. You can use the exact same stat block. If you want to throw, undead fortitude in it, you can, but you don't have to. And so I think one of the greatest things about undead is you could have an undead dragon that is leading everything. You could have a lich that is leading everything. You could have any number of different like super high level monsters and just flip it and say this is now an undead character, and all their minions are undead, and then you can have a cult that is following this undead creature that is rising to godhood, or that is trying to become a demigod or a demon lord or whatever it is, and then just kind of flavoring that as you go. And like we were talking about earlier, when your characters are low level, making sure those encounters are much smaller, and so you're just kind of hinting around at, hey, there's maybe an undead awakening happening here. Like, what's going on with all these undead that are popping up? Are towns shutting their gates at night now? Are they checking people in to make sure that they're not necromancers, or they're not some kind of shady people that are out trying to get more undead, or whatever it may be, and then building it up as you go. And so maybe now we've got to go to an old portal that once brought this undead creature to the material plane, and we've got to go investigate it. And maybe there's not combat there, but it's more of just like an investigation. And then maybe we need to go to its old lair and get some more information about it so that we can learn how to defeat it. And so I think there's a lot you can do with undead that tie in a full-on campaign that won't get stale.
Yeah, especially when you include a lot of the sentient undead, when you have vampires, when you have some of the higher powered, like the mummy lords and things like that have their own motivations, that have their own ability to affect the world without worrying about who the master is or who the necromancer is. There's a whole nother level of immersion that can take place into those societies of undead as well, which can be a lot of fun.
Yeah, most definitely.
Awesome. So before we sign off, let me give both of you the opportunity to share with the Cyclothids where they can connect with you, where they can listen to the podcast, what other projects you might have in the works, anything else you'd like to plug.
We're most active on Instagram at 20 Sides Pod. We do a Monster Manual Monday every Monday. We do a Dungeon Thought Thursday every Thursday, and then we obviously post every single day just to get like the conversation started around Dungeons and Dragons and let people think about characters, and as DMs, let them think about encounters and like how you build campaigns and whatnot. You can find us on YouTube now. Search us up, 20 Sides Podcast. We are going to be launching a Patreon come February-ish, maybe. Like you said earlier, we are a top 100 podcast according to Apple. We are a top 20 podcast in Canada, Australia, and we're a top 15 podcast in Denmark. So
Awesome.
We're all moving to Denmark.
Go where the fans are.
That's right. That's right. So we are on an upward trajectory that we're really, really excited about. We're really happy about. Feel free to connect with us on Instagram, YouTube, and then anywhere you can find your podcast platforms. Or if you want to listen on YouTube, the podcast is slowly being added there as well.
Nice. And I can definitely speak to you ranking so high. I mean, the podcast is excellent. The characters are very good. The story is very good. And the content that you provide on your Instagram is also exceptional as well. You do a very good job of providing very useful information for DMs and for players. And so, Cyclothids, if you haven't checked out 20 Sides, I would strongly encourage you to do so. Jump onto their show, give it a listen. You'll really enjoy it. They do a wonderful job. And thank you both so much for being on today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for having us.
That was a lot of fun having Matt and Bobby on the show. Let's get on to our knowledge check. In today's knowledge check, I want to talk about something that's tangentially related to our topic at hand today, which is violence in games. And the reason it's connected is because most creature-centered campaigns are going to involve hunting down and committing acts of violence against these creatures. So I want to talk about the research and the more recent rebuttals about what violence in games says about becoming violent in real life. Now, most people have heard the argument that violent video games increase violent behavior. It's an argument that has been circulating nearly as long as games themselves. And it's an argument that has some research to back it, detailing that violent games can increase cortisol responses and aggressive thoughts. However, the arguments on the opposite side of this topic suggest that violence in games could instead have a negative correlation with violent or aggressive behavior rather than a positive correlation. There's not a statistical correlation with significant increases in worldwide gaming popularity and levels of worldwide violence. In 2017, a researcher named Gentile and his colleagues conducted research that investigated the aggressive psychological and mental autonomic responses activated by violent games. They found that the flight or fight system was activated, and the release of the stress hormone cortisol was more likely to be activated when participants would play violent games compared to non-violent games. They also found that aggressive thinking behaviors were increased after participants had played violent games. So this sort of research is interesting because it does show that there is a link to the immediacy of violent behavior or the immediate thoughts of violent behavior directly after playing a violent video game. However, another study conducted by Cunningham and Ingolstatter in 2016 actually found that playing violent games could have other effects that instead decrease long-term aggressive behaviors. So the theory here is then you're using violence in games and sort of this as a sort of mental release. So you can still acknowledge the research that existed before that shows the keys of increased cortisol and the immediacy of violent thoughts, but also shows that the flight or fight system can act in a way that satiates the desire for dopamine release in gamers. The idea behind this explanation is it's a cathartic release that will instead decrease the likelihood of violent behavior rather than increase it on a longer time span. So if you don't just look at the immediacy of, I just got done playing a violent game, now I'm going to go out and commit violence. No, they're finding that the effect is actually opposite with more modern research. They're finding that by playing violence in games and having an understanding of the consequences of violence, that cathartic release actually carries forward into our future. And I think one of the things that keyed me into this idea was the book that was written by Steven Pinker, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. It doesn't talk about video games or violence in games specifically, but it does talk about how human behavior has changed so that we are now living in the safest time in the history of mankind with the least amount of overall worldwide violence. And that trend keeps continuing, that even though media focus on violence continues to increase and all of these sort of concepts about everybody thinking that violence is increasing because we see so much of it represented in our media, it's actually the opposite. The worldwide trends of violence have been going down for a very, very long time. So I will acknowledge that my pre-existing bias on this topic wants there to be games that can include violence because I find them to be cathartic, which is sort of supported by the newer research anyways. I also surround myself with others who are like-minded in nature, but my own experience could affect my point. But despite that bias, I find it hard to believe that if the existing assumptions are accurate and playing violent games increases violent behavior, we would see a significant positive relationship between the increasing population of gamers in the world and rates of violent behaviors increasing, but instead what we see is a negative correlation, and I would just submit that as evidence to the contrary. That's all for the show today. Please like us on Facebook, like us on Instagram, and I would really, really love if you can just take a few moments after listening to this episode and jump on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify and leave us a review. Those 5-star reviews go a really long way to helping spread the word about this show and find sponsors for future episodes so that we can continue to grow. I'm really loving bringing all of this content to you, and I want it to keep going for years to come, but I do need to find a way to keep this show growing. And for me, that is to ask all of you to please help me out with a review. So until next time, my cyclothids, we'll see you next session.